During the 19th century, American missionaries journeyed across the continent to bring Christianity to the people living in the vast and settled regions of the American West. Along the way, they helped shape the religious, cultural, and social landscape of this expansive frontier. So let's talk about what these folks did and why. Okay, so the story of U.S. missionaries in the American West begins before the United States even existed. As early as 1541, Spanish Franciscan friars began missions in California, with the goal of converting the native peoples to Catholicism and teaching them agriculture and handicraft skills. Similar missions would be established in New Mexico starting in 1581. Now, this is important to mention because although we usually think of the American West as beginning at the Mississippi River and stretching to the Pacific Ocean, the Spanish had been exploring and working in this area for centuries before it became part of the United States. And these missions often used forced labor of natives to build them and maintain them. And the relationship between the missionaries and the indigenous peoples was not always peaceful. Protestant missionary activity in the Trans-Mississippi West didn't really start until after the U.S. had acquired the Oregon Territory in 1846. But once it did, it started quickly. In 1834, the Methodist Episcopal Church sent the first Protestant missionaries to the West Coast. They established their first mission in the Willamette Valley of modern Oregon. And then in 1836, the Presbyterian Church sent out the famous missionary Marcus Whitman to establish a mission near Walla Walla in modern Washington state. The earliest Protestant missionaries converted few Native Americans, but they did lay the foundation for future missionary work and settlement by raising wheat and vegetables on their farms and sending back reports of the Willamette Valley's fertility. Over time, other denominations like the Mormons would settle along the same valley, attracted by the fertile land and the promise of religious freedom. Now, as the United States continued to expand westward during the mid-19th century, various Christian groups felt a sense of urgency to spread Christianity to the people who were moving to these new territories. This growing concern led to the creation of the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, otherwise known as the ABCFM, in 1810. The ABCFM became the largest missionary organization in the United States and played a significant role in directing American missionary activity, including efforts within the United States itself. By the 1830s, it was encouraging missionaries to move west and establish missions in newly created territories. The American Missionary Association, which broke off from the ABCFM in 1846, focused specifically on sending missionaries west. Both organizations supported settlement and education in the territories as well as explicitly missionary work. To put it simply, the 19th century saw a huge growth in American missionary activity both domestically and abroad. And the establishment of missions in the American West was just one part of that larger trend. As American settlers moved west, denominations like the Methodists, Baptists, and Presbyterians worked to create new congregations in these areas. In the West, this was especially true after the U.S. acquired vast territories following the Mexican-American War in 1848. But there was also a unique American religious movement known as Mormonism that significantly contributed to the settlement of the West. The followers of Mormonism, who called themselves the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, were founded by Joseph Smith in upstate New York in 1830. From its start, Mormonism had a strong missionary component to it, sending out missionaries to convert others to the new faith. But this missionary zeal was coupled with a desire to find a place where Mormons could establish a permanent religious homeland free from persecution. After facing years of hostility and violence in the eastern states, Mormon leader Brigham Young led his followers on a trek west, eventually settling in the Great Salt Lake Valley in present-day Utah in 1847. Over the next decades, the Mormons would continue to migrate west, establishing communities throughout the region. While most Mormons came to Utah seeking refuge and a place to practice their religion freely, they also engaged in missionary work to convert Native Americans to their faith. Now, it's important to understand that not all missionaries had the same experiences or perspectives. Some missionaries grappled with the implications of their faith in a colonial context and questioned the morality of American expansion into Native American lands. For instance, some missionaries spoke out against Andrew Jackson's Indian removal policy in the 1830s. Having witnessed indigenous peoples in the American West adopting Christian practices and civilized ways, they argued forcefully against the president's policy of forcibly relocating tribal nations further west. Many missionaries, though, viewed the United States' seizure of indigenous lands as divinely ordained and supported westward expansion. In fact, many evangelical reformers viewed the entire American project as part of a grand biblical mission to spread Christianity and civilization among the heathens and the wild men of the frontier. For these folks, the U.S. government's commitment to manifest destiny was completely compatible with the Christian duty to spread the gospel. Beyond their support for U.S. territorial acquisition, missionaries were critical to the process of settler colonialism. At times, missionaries served as the advance guard for settlers moving into new territories. In the Oregon Country, for example, American missionaries arrived before large numbers of settlers and established settlements that then attracted new homesteaders looking for community and security. Once there, missionaries often formed close relationships with local leaders, sometimes mediating disputes between settlers and indigenous peoples. And as American settlements grew into towns and cities, missionaries usually remained a powerful force, building schools and other public buildings that served both Native Americans and white settlers. Missionary work in the West was not always met with acceptance. Native Americans resisted cultural change and some tribes fought back against missionaries trying to convert them. However, other Native Americans showed interest in Christianity and some converts became active missionaries themselves. Missionaries generally preferred to live among the Native Americans they were trying to convert, learning their languages and customs in order to better communicate with them. At times, this meant adopting traditional clothing and eating habits. However, despite this cultural sensitivity, missionaries also exhibited cultural imperialism. In their desire to convert Native Americans, missionaries often tried to replace traditional beliefs with Christianity and sometimes discouraged Native Americans from speaking their native languages or partaking in traditional ceremonies. Despite these tensions, some missionaries stood in solidarity with Native Americans against the federal government. During the 1850s, for instance, some missionaries spoke out against the U.S. government's plans to remove Native Americans from their lands in order to make room for settlers. Missionaries like these who advocated for the rights of Native Americans represented a small but significant portion of those working in the West to spread Christianity. Finally, beyond their spiritual work, missionaries were also agents of economic development in the American West. They introduced new forms of agriculture, ranching, and manufacturing to the region and often linked these new industries to their cultural civilizing mission. Missionaries built farms and ranches that produced food and provided employment for settlers. They also established schools and other public buildings that contributed to the economic growth of communities. In this way, missionaries were not only religious actors, but also participated in the social, political, and economic changes taking place in the American West. In conclusion, U.S. missionaries played a vital role in the settlement and colonization of the American West during the 19th century. Motivated by a desire to spread Christianity and support westward expansion, missionaries from various denominations like the Mormons established missions in new territories. Their work was guided by organizations like the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions and the American Missionary Association. Although not all missionaries supported American expansion, most viewed it as part of a divine mission to spread civilization and Christianity among Native Americans. They often served as intermediaries between Native Americans and settlers, advocating for peaceful coexistence and at times opposing government policies that threatened Native American communities. Despite cultural clashes and tensions, some missionaries made efforts to learn Native American languages and customs, while others criticized the forced assimilation of Native Americans. Ultimately, missionaries were not only religious figures, but also participants in the economic and social changes brought on by westward expansion. They introduced new agricultural and manufacturing techniques and contributed to the growth of schools and other institutions that shaped the character of Western communities. So that's what U.S. missionaries were doing out in the American West during the 19th century. If you want to hear more about a particular denomination or missionary society or a particular region within the American West, please let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching. Subscribe if you want more and come back soon. The Spanish missions had an enormous and multifaceted effect on the Native Americans who lived in the West. Well, if you're taking my course, you already know this. But if you're not, you're about to find out. In order to understand the impact of the Spanish missions, we can look at how they changed Native American culture, religion, daily life, and politics. Okay, so first off, let's talk about culture and religion. So the main goal of the missions was to convert Native Americans to Christianity, mostly Catholicism. To do this, missionaries taught the Native Americans about Christian sacraments like baptism and communion. Now this often replaced or modified traditional indigenous spiritual practices. For example, some native rituals were partially incorporated into Christian rites to make the transition easier. But at the same time, indigenous religions were actively suppressed. And this had a huge impact on Native American culture because religion and spirituality are such a big part of a culture. They really tried to get rid of traditional beliefs and practices. They actually forced native populations to live in mission settlements, which were called reductions. And this really messed with their traditional village life. See, these reductions were basically like restructured versions of traditional villages, but they were built according to Spanish colonial patterns and under the direct control of missionaries. So instead of having a village council where decisions were made by a group of elders, they imposed a system where the priest was at the top and then there were appointed Native American leaders under him. This change in leadership and decision-making had a ripple effect on all aspects of village life. The way people organized themselves socially and politically changed. The Spanish missions also brought a bunch of new stuff into Native American life, including a new language, Spanish, new clothes, new agricultural practices, and domestic animals. All of this gradually changed what Native Americans ate, wore, how they farmed, and how they lived and worked. Like, imagine going from herding buffalo to planting crops like wheat and grapes. That's a big change. And then there's the new clothes and language. It's like going from wearing animal skins to wearing, Spanish-style outfits and speaking Spanish instead of your native language. These changes didn't happen overnight, but over time they really reshaped Native American culture. Speaking of changes, let's talk about education. The Spanish missions had a big impact on how Native Americans were educated. Instead of the more informal ways of teaching that existed in indigenous cultures, the missions set up schools and a more structured curriculum. Native American children were separated from their families and communities and taught Spanish, math, reading, writing, and, of course, Catholicism. This was done with the goal of assimilating the Native Americans into Spanish culture and making them more easily controllable subjects of the Spanish Empire. This separation of families and communities was a big departure from the more communal and family-focused approach to education that had been used in indigenous cultures. It's like going from a really tight-knit family structure to living in a school dormitory. It's a huge change. It really goes to the heart of what it means to be a kid and to learn. Okay, so another interesting thing about the missions is that the Spanish missionaries sometimes protected Native Americans from being exploited by other Spanish settlers or slave raiders. They did this by bringing them into the mission system, which was supposed to be a safe space. But this protection wasn't always real because Native communities still faced harsh labor systems and restrictions on their movement and activities. So, yes, they were protected from one kind of danger, but they were exposed to another. It's a complicated situation. And the thing is, despite these efforts to protect Native Americans, the Spanish colonial system still participated in the enslavement of indigenous people. Many Native Americans were captured in wars with the Spanish and sold as slaves in the colonial system. Others were simply bought or stolen and then forced to work in mines, plantations, or as domestic servants. The Spanish missionaries were totally opposed to this. They sometimes justified slavery as a way to control and Christianize indigenous populations. So, it's like they were trying to do good, but they were also participating in some really bad stuff. It's a really morally complex situation. And if you're interested in learning more about slavery in the Spanish colonial system, check out this video right here. Another negative effect of the missions was the introduction of old world diseases like smallpox. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, they brought with them diseases that indigenous people had no immunity against. Smallpox was one of the worst. It spread quickly through Native American populations and caused massive devastation. For example, when the Spanish came to the Pueblo people, they brought smallpox with them. And within a few years, it's estimated that 90% of the Pueblo people had died. That's a huge loss of life. And it really weakened the indigenous communities, especially since many of those who died were young and healthy adults. It's like losing your whole workforce to a disease. It's devastating. These diseases not only killed a lot of people, but they also disrupted traditional ways of life and economic systems. For example, with a huge chunk of the population wiped out, traditional farming and hunting practices were disrupted. Over time, Native communities developed blended cultures that combined Catholicism with aspects of their traditional heritage. They also adopted the Spanish language as a common medium, and used it to express their culture and communicate with both indigenous and Spanish speakers. This linguistic blending is really fascinating. For example, many Native American languages incorporated Spanish words related to religion, food, clothing, and government. You can see it in the languages of the Pueblo people, the Chumash and the Hopi, just to name a few. The Spanish missions also helped Native Americans develop new art forms. Native artists started creating works that combined religious themes with indigenous symbols and motifs. This blending of cultures is really evident in things like pottery, weaving, and even religious imagery. Another important effect of the missions was that they gave some Native Americans the ability to read and write in Spanish. This was a big deal because it allowed them to communicate with the Spanish authorities and advocate for their rights. For example, some Native Americans became scribes, recording important events and creating petitions to the Spanish government. This is a fascinating chapter in Native American history, because it shows how indigenous people took the tools of their oppressors and used them to fight for their rights. It's like using the Spanish language against the Spanish. So let's talk about politics. The Spanish missions were a key part of Spain's colonial project in the West. Their main political purpose was to control and pacify the indigenous populations, bringing them into the Spanish Empire. The missions were closely tied to the military and the government, and they worked together to achieve these political goals. For example, the missionaries often went on missions with soldiers and helped to negotiate treaties with Native American groups. They also kept the Spanish government informed about the Native Americans in their area, including their numbers, their resources, and any potential threats they might pose. This close relationship between the missions and the government really highlights the political nature of the missions. They weren't just about spreading Christianity. They were also about controlling and integrating indigenous populations into the Spanish colonial system. The Spanish missions achieved this integration by imposing Spanish laws and customs on Native Americans and encouraging them to adopt the Spanish way of life. For example, the missions set up courts to deal with legal matters, and they established systems to collect taxes and enforce obedience to the Spanish crown. This imposition of Spanish political authority really limited the sovereignty of Native American groups and made them subject to the laws and regulations of the colonial government. It's like going from having your own self-governing community to being ruled by a foreign power. It's a big shift. To sum it up, the Spanish missions had a dramatic effect on Native American life. They brought new religious beliefs and practices, new ways of living and working, and new opportunities for education and advancement. But they also brought disease, slavery, and political control. The legacy of the missions continues to be felt today in the cultures and communities of Native Americans. From the architecture and art to the language and beliefs, the Spanish missions left an indelible mark on the West and the indigenous people who lived there. So yeah, the Spanish missions are a really important part of the story of the West, and understanding them is crucial to understanding the history of the United States. Hi, this is your host. And welcome to Crash Course Geography, where we explore the patterns and processes that have shaped our world and its people. Today, we're going to explore how religion, specifically Protestant missionaries, influenced the settlement and culture of the United States. As the United States expanded across the North American continent during the 19th century, Protestant missionaries traveled into newly acquired territories to spread Christianity. While the vast majority of Native Americans who encountered missionaries did not convert, the missionaries did play an important role in the settlement and culture of the United States. So today we'll be looking at 3 specific ways that Protestant missionaries influenced the settlement of the West. First, Protestant missionaries were some of the first non-indigenous people to settle in new Western territories. For example, after the U.S. acquired the Oregon Territory in 1846, Protestant missionaries from the Methodist and Presbyterian churches arrived in the Willamette Valley in the 1830s. In order to make a mission in a new territory, the missionaries would establish a mission building, sometimes called a mission house, which served as a dwelling for the missionaries, a church for services, and a school for teaching children. These mission stations were also typically for more than a single family operation. Often they were home to several families working together to establish a community in the new territory. Now, these missionaries did not come out west to engage in farming or ranching, but they did need to survive while they were carrying out their missions. Thus, in addition to the mission house and church, most missionaries had their own farm. Not only did this provide them with sustenance, but it also demonstrated the possibilities of farming in the new territories. Missionaries who farmed sent letters back east describing the richness of the soils and abundance of the land, stimulating interest in settling in the region. For example, Jason Lee, a pioneer missionary in Oregon, wrote enthusiastically about the fertile Willamette Valley, which he described as a, quote, land of promise, end quote. Such reports helped attract settlers to the region. In fact, many of the early missionaries had specific connections to farming. Like John Gant, who managed his father's large farm in Ohio before heading out to Oregon with his wife and 5 daughters. Similarly, Marcus Whitman, who came from a long line of farmers, apprenticed as a doctor after studying theology for 2 years. But when he heard about the mission in Oregon, he decided to follow that calling instead. Even those without farming experience, like Lee, were quick learners. He had never plowed a field or planted a tree before arriving in Oregon, but he spent his first winter on the mission farm learning from others. Then in the spring, he planted crops, raised hogs and sheep, and even built a grist mill, which he described as a, quote, most excellent and sufficient mill, end quote. This heavy emphasis on farming was very characteristic of the Protestant missionaries who headed west. It wasn't just their livelihoods, it was also a way of life that they wanted to share with other settlers who might move to the area. Second, Protestant missionaries brought institutional and ideological support to settler colonialism. From the perspective of many Protestant missionaries, evangelizing Native Americans was part of a divine mission that went hand in hand with U.S. territorial expansion. This is because Protestant missionaries believed it was their God-given responsibility to bring Christianity and civilization to the so-called savages and heathen. And they saw their mission as an extension of the U.S. government's manifest destiny to expand and transform the West. For example, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, which sent missionaries into Native American territories, explicitly stated that their purpose was to prepare the way for civilization, stating that, quote, the object of this board is to promote the knowledge and practice of the Christian religion among the heathen in such a manner as to introduce the light of the gospel into all the various regions and tribes of the great family of Nan, end quote. Furthermore, once missionaries were on the ground, they reinforced these beliefs. Through their interactions with local Native Americans, missionaries confirmed their sense of manifest destiny. As one missionary put it, quote, "We find ourselves in the midst of a savage population who know not the Lord nor the power of his resurrection, and live without law or order in the most degraded state of barbarism." End quote. By justifying the expansion of the United States as a way to spread Christianity and improve the lives of Native Americans, Protestant missionaries became ardent supporters of U.S. territorial acquisition and settlement. Third, the missionary movement itself grew through internal expansion. That is, as settlers moved out west and new communities developed, there was a growing need for churches and ministers to serve them. So the missionary movement responded to this demand by sending new missionaries to these areas. For example, the Oregon Mission, one of the first organized missionary efforts in the Pacific Northwest, began in 1834 with two main goals, quote, "to explore the Great Valley of the Willamette and to found a permanent mission in that territory," end quote. When the missionaries returned east, they reported that the valley was ripe for settlement, which inspired many to move out west. Within just a few years, the Oregon Mission had expanded from 2 missionaries to 20 families. And soon thousands of settlers had moved to the Willamette Valley as well. In general, Protestant missionaries were successful at creating new congregations and spreading evangelicalism in a number of ways. One was through their establishment of circuits and networks of ordained ministers who traveled between settlements to hold services, preach and baptize converts. Another was the development of mission schools, which provided religious instruction for children and adults and often served as centers for community life. In particular, the Methodists and Baptists excelled at organizing and administering geographically dispersed congregations, which proved useful as they expanded into new territories. Missionary activity also helped build social cohesion in the frontier by bringing established institutions of the East Coast, like churches and schools, to new communities in the West. The arrival of missionaries helped settlers feel more at home in the frontier by replicating familiar surroundings. Finally, the missionary movement intersected with other aspects of the Second Great Awakening, especially education and moral reform. Many missionaries were motivated by evangelical ideals to tackle social ills and improve the quality of life for settlers on the frontier. For example, they led efforts to improve roads, establish public schools, fight against slavery, improve sanitation and housing conditions, and combat alcohol abuse. One of the most well-known examples of the influence of religion on settlement is the Mormon migration to Utah. The Mormons, officially called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, combined evangelical zeal with territorial settlement in a unique way. Members of the church believed they were fulfilling a biblical mandate to, quote, "spread out from the valleys of the mountains," end quote, and they sought to create a homeland in the West. After facing persecution for their unique beliefs in the eastern United States, Mormons began migrating to the Midwest and eventually the Great Basin. There they founded settlements like Nauvoo, Commerce, and eventually Salt Lake City. The geographic mobility of the Mormons and the establishment of Zion in the distant West demonstrate how religious ideas can combine with settlement patterns to shape cultural landscapes. Although missionary efforts were largely unsuccessful in converting Native Americans, Protestant missionaries played a major role in the settlement and culture of the United States. First, they were often the first non-Native Americans to settle in new Western territories, where they established missions and farms. Second, they provided institutional and ideological support to settler colonialism by framing evangelization as part of the U.S. government's manifest destiny to expand and transform the West. Third, the missionary movement grew through internal expansion as settlers moved westward and created new communities that needed churches and ministers. Missionaries also helped build social cohesion in the frontier by replicating familiar institutions from back east. Finally, the missionary movement intersected with other social reform movements, demonstrating how religious goals and nation-building can go hand in hand. Though they didn't succeed in converting large numbers of Native Americans, Protestant missionaries, along with their farms and churches, contributed to the cultural reshaping of the West and bolstered U.S. expansionist policies. Many maps and borders represent modern geopolitical divisions that have often been decided without the consultation, permission or recognition of the land's original inhabitants. Many geographical place names also don't reflect the indigenous or aboriginal people's languages. So we want to acknowledge these people as traditional and ongoing relationship with that land and all the physical and human geographical elements of it. We encourage you to learn about the history of the place you call home through resources like Native Land Sea and by engaging with your local indigenous and aboriginal nations through the websites and resources they provide. Thanks for watching this episode, which was filmed at a studio and was made with the help of all these nice people. If you want to help keep this content free for everyone forever, you can join our community on a crowdfunding platform.